Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca L. Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenidos.
Welcome back, everyone. Today in our episode, we are joined by scholar and activist Dr. Jennifer Martinez-Medina. We recorded this conversation on Friday, March 22nd, 2024, over Zoom. Dr. Martinez-Medina is an assistant professor of politics, policy, law, and ethics at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. Our discussion touches on various aspects of her research and work, with a focus on the effects of the climate crisis on farm workers in Oregon.
Before the interview, we will share a bit of background on Dr. Martinez-Medina, her research, her public works, and the ways in which she engages in both simultaneously. After the interview has concluded, we will be back to share our thoughts and key takeaways from the conversation. Dr. Jennifer Martinez-Medina is an interdisciplinary scholar who engages in migration and transnational mobilization studies. Her research focuses on how families exercise political and social rights across borders and seeks to explain how community care and mutual support are shaped by interlocking identity formation structured by globalization, extractive labor regimes, and our topic of the semester, climate change.
She earned her Bachelor's of Science from San Diego State University with a degree in Criminal Justice Administration. Then, at the University of Texas, Arlington, she obtained her master's in public administration. Later, she moved to Portland, Oregon, where she completed her PhD in public affairs and policy at Portland State University. In Texas, she worked in local government as a financial analyst, and in Oregon, she has served on a range of local councils, commissions, and community boards.
Martinez-Medina combines her background in public policy with social science perspective to employ participatory action research and practical applications in order to generate social change. She does this through combining qualitative and quantitative research methods and experimenting with storytelling, art, and a variety of advocacy strategies to communicate findings back to the communities of impact.
She examines how groups challenge conditions of racial inequality by studying mobilization techniques used within and beyond the state, specifically through the lenses of various diaspora groups. Her research engages in questions of how free market policies and globalization impact expressions of community, citizenship, and participation.
Martinez-Medina is the daughter of farm workers and the sister of a deported veteran, and considers her family's legacy in both California and Mexico as foundational to how she understands political rights across borders. She views her hometown as at the juncture of local needs and global demands that create several obstacles, including income, class, identity, gender, race, immigration status, food system, and environment. Her drive to engage in public service stems from these origins.
She has felt most at home merging the academic world with community and advocacy, and that's something we absolutely hear in her interview. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, she used her research skills along with her lived experience to help facilitate the Oregon COVID-19 farm worker study. She also worked on the Voces del Campo podcast story at California's State Institute for Rural Studies. This project focused on how historical exclusions of the National Labor Relations Act complicate retirement for farm workers. And she co-founded Desolate, a zine created to tell the stories of immigrant veterans. The efforts behind the zine led to a strong immigrant coalition rallying behind the Leave No One Behind mural project, which urges action from Biden and Congress to enact ethical immigration reform.
Martinez-Medina integrates her research skills with community outreach, advocacy, and storytelling to help inform and perhaps even guide today's governance demands, and we're excited to have her here with us on the podcast. Hola, Jennifer. Welcome to the Latinx Vision podcast. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. How are you?
Hola, Rojo. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. And happy to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
It's really exciting for us because we're on the East Coast to get some perspectives that come from other parts of the country. So it was really exciting when Lisbeth suggested you as a guest for our season on climate activism. So welcome.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off with a question about your research and how it has considered how free market policies and globalization impact local communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about the specifics of this impact on farm worker communities in particular?
Yeah, sure. So I think it all begins for me. The reason why I even saw academia, it begins in my hometown, right, where I was born in the Centro Valle de California, Bakersfield, and I lived in an unincorporated community most of my life outside of Bakersfield. And I mean, if you ever look through the grocery store, most of your food comes from that region. So this region in California is sort of the world's refrigerator. And it's a really unique place because if you ever drive through Bakersfield growing up, or when I went to college, most of my friends would say, "Oh yeah, I know Bakersfield. It smelled like cows, and there wasn't anything out there." But the truth is that there are different crops. Most food is grown there, so there are armies of farm workers that work during different harvests. And not only that, there is, even though in general, California has sort of transitioned out of oil, Kern County in particular is one of the counties richest in oil extraction. And because of these different industries, this is a region that suffers some of the most toxic air. There's so much heat heat waves are just intensifying across the country. This is also true for the Central Valley. Water quality is also dismal because of this extraction. And you really see it as well in La Comunidad, right? And so this really just shaped my lenses on how I view the world. And now I'm here in Oregon, and while we don't really see oil as much here, there is still, deep agricultural work happening.
Yeah. Jennifer, you released a study with a group of researchers on the adverse effects of COVID-19 in the lives of Latinx farm workers. Can you tell us about the study and in a specific what policies or strategies are needed to ameliorate the livelihoods and access to essential social services for farm workers?
Híjole, a lot of times we think that COVID is gone, right? But we know that so many people are suffering from long COVID. There's still breakouts that happen. You just don't count them anymore, right? And so let me just tell you a little background. When I helped launch the study, I was finishing up my PhD. I had just defended my proposal, and I was supposed to go out to Mexico and do some field research out there on civic capacity and remittances. But that didn't happen. But because my parents have been farm workers their whole lives, my whole family has, I had already done some work with a few organizations, I've created a few networks out in California, particularly the California Institute for Rural Studies, which is an independent research institute that focuses on agricultural communities and does rural research. I had done a podcast with them on farm worker retirement and really the lack of retirement and livelihood farm workers experience in their older years. Entonces, we were all sort of like, okay, this is going to be bad. When we first heard of COVID, I know that some of the intensity was happening, at least on the West Coast in Washington and in Los Angeles. And we knew it was going to be bad. It was going to be bad for everybody. But we are there was a group of scholars and advocates, community organizations that work directly with farm workers. So we knew that we needed a document. We needed a document to ensure that whatever protections there were, farm workers were receiving them. We needed to mobilize because we knew that there needed to be safety nets for farm workers. And a lot of times there's been a hesitancy to do that from the federal government or any government at all, and growers especially. And so what it ended up happening, just hindsight, reflecting on what the COVID-19 farm worker study did, is first of all, it was a tri-state study. It happened in California, happened in Oregon, happened in Washington. So it really got to give us a glimpse of farm workers across those 3 states. And hindsight, I think it worked as a census of farm workers, porque a lot of times it's really hard to get I hate this word. Farm workers are not a community that's hard to reach, right? But it's a community that shows resistance and in, providing information, because a lot of times that information has been mobilized against them, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, a lot of the data that we have out there is like the National Agricultural Worker Survey, which is a great survey because it gives us a benchmark of what's happening. But en verdad, it's a survey that is done through growers who select specific farm workers. And a lot of times what we see there might not actually capture what's happening, in real time in the fields. And so across the 3 states, so what we found are just a few different things in terms of demographics, but I'll focus specifically on COVID impacts. One, as we know, farm workers were labeled essential, something we already knew. Pero la cosa es que that essentiality didn't really come with any funding. It didn't come with extra protection, right? It was just definitely, you could see this, and it happened in the meatpacking facilities as well. It was a label to continue to force workers into their workplaces and to produce, even though a lot of them were very fearful about their health or what would happen to their health, and not only their own health, but also their family's health. And so there are so many intersections here. So we heard early on that, even though governments were sharing PPE to grow with growers, that wasn't reaching farm workers. La Ayuda wasn't reaching farm workers. A lot of states, especially on the West Coast, passed family leave acts and sick leave, and they buffed those policies up. But a lot of times, informally, when farm workers tried to use those new reliefs, el mayordomo le decía, nope, that's not for you. And of course, there was a lot of variation between documentation status and also indigeneity for farm workers that don't speak Spanish as their primary language or indigenous. They face so much more discrimination in many ways. We also saw the gender gap, right? Las mujeres were the first ones to be let go early on, or they just couldn't work, right? Porque no les salía. Farm workers really work on a very set budget, right? They have to work really hard to make the exact money to live, like to barely make enough to live. And so when there are shifts or there are any interruptions, it really reduces the ability for farm workers to fulfill their budget. So for mujeres, it wouldn't make sense for them to pay for babysitters, right?
Exactly.
When they're not even getting the full hours. So a lot of them stayed home. And then, of course, the school shut down. So several of them, many of them were forced basically to be at home. And, and that does create impacts. It creates long-term impacts. In my engagement with the communities now, I see the difference. They haven't recovered economically from that. Mentally, their students, their children faced a lot of mental health issues. And, todavía están presente. And it really does impact intergenerationally, right? And so let's see. Another thing that came out of that is food insecurity in general, just inability, economic violence, if you will. But I think food insecurity is so important to talk about, because how is it that the people that produce our food, that harvest our food, that have all this knowledge on how to grow food, can afford it? And That was also very prominent in the study.
It's a cruel irony indeed.
¿Verdad? Yes, and it's really an indicator of how unsustainable our system is, and also how policy is made to produce that, right? Like it's intentional that they can't afford food, and I mean we could probably pick this apart and see how that happens in so many different ways.
Can you talk about those policies? Yeah, as well, because your
sure.
study also like present recommendations in those and it gets into the specifics of policies, but also strategies of dealing with all these issues that you have talked about just now.
Yeah, aquí in Oregon, so I focused mostly on the study in Oregon. What we focused on was advocating for safety nets. The here started an Oregon Worker Relief Fund, and we're very fortunate in Oregon that we have strong farm workers serving and immigrant serving organizations. And we have a Unión PCUN, Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste, that, you know, do their work, and they went into overtime during this time, right? And so they were able to create this community fund for farm workers. And this system, though, the structure of the Oregon Worker Relief Fund initially was really important for COVID, but now they're using the same model for creating a climate fund for farm workers, because again, if they don't work, they lose money. So this model has been very useful because now it really protects farm workers from actually intersecting with the government if they're, you know, if they wouldn't do that. You know, that was one of the other findings we saw. There's a chilling effect around public charge. And so farm workers just did, even if they qualified for safety nets, they would not seek them, or they were really nervous about it.
Sure.
As we remember, Trump was still in office. And so this relief fund really helped with that. And so there was some more funding for that. We also talk about something that I haven't mentioned yet is the enforcement in the workplace. It's really important. You know, a lot of the OSHAs across the states are underfunded. Here in the West Coast, we're lucky that we have our own state OSHAs, the bodies that enforce the rules in the workplace, but they're so underfunded. During COVID, I think they carried out the fewest investigations that they ever have.
Wow.
You know, so how do we know farm workers are being protected during this time? And this is systemic, right? It happens even outside of a crisis.
Politics of neglect. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And so that was one of our policy recommendations. It's like to not only beef up, you know, the number of investigators, but ensure that they're culturally and linguistically equipped to speak with farm workers. Oregon is a little bit unique because about 30% of the farm worker population is indigenous. And we were able to really drill down to like, ¿qué pueblo es? ¿Qué pueblos son, verdad? And so within a sample of just like 300 farm workers in our initial survey, and then we followed up with in-depth interviews. But just in that small sample, we found that farm workers speak over 29 different distinct indigenous Mesoamerican languages. So, you know, it like really increases and deepens the nuance in how we understand how we need to communicate with farm workers, what their needs are.
Yeah. And so, you know, you were mentioning the issues around mental health and the livelihoods of farm workers during COVID, but we wanted to sort of expand that beyond COVID as well. Like how have the climate crisis and environmental conditions, I mean, including exposure to COVID, but also things like wildfires and flooding, which we're seeing immense increases in the West Coast in particular, how have those impacted mental health and livelihoods of the farm workers, particularly in these regions prone to extreme weather events?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in 2020 here in Oregon, we also had historical wildfires. Really displaced so many communities. The skies were red. You hear that in some of our interviews because we were still conducting or collecting data during that time, and farm workers were describing just the poor quality air quality, right? Many of them were still working out there, even though there were wildfires, right? And so people were talking about how their eyes were burning, how their throats were hurting, right? So even though this was a study about COVID, I think it talks a lot about what happens in crisis, right? The gaps in support during crisis like COVID, but also we captured a little bit of the ongoing climate change, right? And I think everything we found during the COVID study still applies for other events that happen. And that is that there's just poor communication. We don't have the systems in place to communicate with farm workers, especially when information changes, right? We can't get information to them quickly enough that's accurate and in the languages, again, that they're most comfortable speaking. And same thing, like we need support specifically for them, right? I was just doing a community mapping recently around climate hazards and climate change and environmental justice community mapping in the Willamette Valley. And, the farm workers were like, yeah, during the wildfires, we saw a few people here that had already been ordered evacuated, but they didn't know where to go. So they had all their stuff and they were just kind of hanging out. And we were in this area that they came to was about to get evacuated. So we have nowhere to go if an emergency happens, right? So just kind of understanding that. I think on the other side, after a disaster does happen, it's recovery, right? Pero para farm workers and immigrants, Latinx communities, recovery looks different because they can't always access those little pockets of support. Like interacting with FEMA is not easy, especially if you're undocumented, right? And there's a health piece here too, right? The comorbidities, as they call it. Many farm workers already have other, suffer from other conditions, chronic conditions. And when you layer that, it's really important to think about what access to medical attention they have. And what I've heard is, first of all, there are so many barriers for farm workers to seek medical attention. There are clínicas, and I think the clínicas around Oregon, some are doing some good work, and they're an important source of information and also medical care. But I've also heard that a lot of times they don't really listen to what farm workers need. Farm workers don't feel the most comfortable, like they're really being taken care of, right? There's also this gap in connecting their working conditions or their work to their health conditions, right? There's this resistance. When we don't do that, then we don't really understand what the impacts of pesticides have been, what the impacts of heat exposure, of poor air, quality conditions have been. So I think there's that gap as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about healthcare. Yeah, you started talking about healthcare, but let's talk about like the conjunction of healthcare and housing. You also mentioned displacement. Can you talk more on the disparities that the Latinx farm workers are experiencing in relationship also to the climate crisis?
Yeah. When it comes to housing, there's a few different pieces here. One is that we have farm workers that have been working in the field in agriculture, in the nurserías, in the bosques for decades, right? They've been here, they're settled. But there's also a group that migrates, right? And they might live in farm labor housing. And then there's also H-2A workers that might just come for a season. And if their contract's extended, they might stay again. But they also live in farm labor housing. And I think there's really a big difference between those farm workers that live in farm labor housing and those that might be settled. That being that, those in farm labor housing are more isolated. But truly, if you see some of these camps, they're just not adequate. Pesticide drift is present. If they need medical attention, they need to talk to their boss, their grower, or whoever's managing their contract to give them a ride. So we're really talking about two different groups and access that they may have. So I just wanted to put that out there. And in terms of housing for folks that have lived in the community for decades, también hay problemas. And uno del problema es que the housing crisis is also terrible out here. Like, people cannot afford rent. Most farm workers here in Oregon rent like a 2-bedroom apartment. And the thing is that if you can't afford rent, you got to figure out how to make ends meet. And what a lot of communities do, a lot of farm workers do, is they live with multiple families, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that intersects with what happens if you are sick. And this happened during COVID, right? It was not just
Exactly.
one family that got sick. If someone, because we knew the infection rate was it was so contagious, right? It was a whole household that got sick. And, it really, again, puts into perspective just the vulnerability. También a lot of places here in Oregon used to be a very temperate place, right? Like the summers were pretty okay, 70s, 80s,
Mild.
90s, yeah, mild.
Hmm.
Now, I mean, in just in 2021, last year we had a heat dome, and in 2021, we also had a heat wave that claimed the life of one indigenous Guatemalan worker, Sebastian Perez. And, so farm workers are dying from heat here. And when we think about their housing, a lot of them don't have the ACs in place, right? Because we didn't ever need it. We recently had an ice storm in January, and you think of an ice storm, okay, it gets cold outside. Maybe you can't drive for a day. One, that's different for farm workers because now they can't work. But two, there was a thick layer of ice. Like we were all stuck for like almost a week and a half. We were all like, what? Isn't this supposed to melt? Why isn't this melting? And it was terrible. But we don't know we've never had this, right? So many people died. They froze, right? Hypothermia. But not only that, trees were falling. They were hitting electrical lines. There was one just unfortunate family, this very sad story, that a tree hit them, an electrical power line fell. They got off the car. It was parents and the two daughters, a baby and an older daughter. They got out of the car and they got electrocuted because of the ice and electric poles, right? Like who's supposed to know that? And apparently the baby didn't get electrocuted because the tires are enough buffers. But I mean, I don't know that. Like none of us know these hazards that sprout
Exactly.
when our climate is changing.
They're new issues that your area didn't have to deal with. Like some people in certain areas, they're used to certain weather effects and like how to behave, but these things are all so drastically different than anything we've experienced in the past. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I think information, none of us know what to do, right? And so as information is changing, I think it's really important just to ensure that we have groups that are thinking about farm workers specifically. Pero no más la información, we need money. We need to provide safety nets, right? Without the fear of maybe that being used against you in the future, in your future immigration processes. And protection in the workplace, like, farm workers, yeah, they're working. Wildfire smoke is huge now, right? So, really thinking of what equipment farm workers need to be able to do this work if they're going to do this work, but do it in a way that protects their health. And we haven't gotten there. And yeah, I think, but there's still so many, groups that are mobilizing. Farm workers themselves, I mean, they know exactly the issues and they're very articulate about what needs to change. Yes, es la cosa, right? Farm workers have always been neglected politically. That's why the farm labor movement was so important. And now, I mean, with here in Oregon, they passed recently wildfire safety rules. They passed heat rules. And they passed an overtime law, which was so important for farm workers. But la cosa now is like growers are like, oh, well, first of all, growers got money to pay overtime, but they're still super hesitant. And there's like a lot of narratives are like, oh, now I'm going to cut your hours just because I can't pay. And so there's this resistance to support farm workers because there's this idea that we need cheap labor. And this is, comes from institutionalized slavery and Jim Crow. And, it's like really, when we think about climate, like those same things happen. Those same conditions impact farm workers more concentrated in a way that's more concentrated than perhaps other groups that might have the ability to buy a hotel, skip town, and wait till the heat wave is over, or wait till it's safe to come back to their homes, right? Like farm workers can do that to
Right.
stay in place.
Yes, the laws are weaponized against them, right? Like it's instead of protecting them, becomes like a source of discrimination, of neglect, of One thing that I appreciate from your study is how it talks about farm workers, it talks about Latinx farm workers, but it also like pays attention to specific groups, and you talked a little bit about that. One area that your study covers is the impact of COVID, but also environmental degradation and climate crisis in indigenous communities, right? What are some of the most pressing challenges indigenous farm workers face regarding labor rights and workplace conditions?
So here in the U.S., discrimination for sure. But let me kind of pull it back a little bit. I think that overall, the reason why, and we see this too with increasing numbers of us asylees and refugees, right? Kind of changing up migration patterns. Indigenous farm workers are being displaced from their hometowns, right? Not only because economic displacement, but that's so important. Economic displacement is so important, and it's like it's very similar to what happened in the 90s, right? Pero no solamente eso, with the introduction of NAFTA, climate change is also pushing indigenous communities away from their hometown lands or their homelands. And so I heard a lot in our studies, in our interviews, farm workers continue to send money back home. They have strong ties with their, transnational contacts con sus familias. This especially ramped up during COVID. But what we have been hearing as well is that in their families back home, they're experiencing drought. Like right now, Oaxaca has so many wildfires, right? And these are comunidades that live off their milpas. They live off the land, not only because that's their livelihood in terms of what they sell, but that's also their livelihood in terms of what they cook for themselves throughout the year. And if you cannot tend to your land, if you cannot harvest, if you cannot cultivate it, not only does that create, displace your identity, but it also displaces you economically, right? And because of climate change. Another thing is people are talking about contamination of water, of the rios, ¿verdad? And so I think all of this is connected. And even though it's happening in Mexico, it has localized effects because farm workers in here are having to subsidize their family members. So it becomes like a continuous cycle of extraction.
You're speaking about like the indigenous workers, both in the U.S., but from their home countries. And it kind of gets us thinking about how does indigenous, like the sustainable agricultural practices and their knowledge clash with the monoculture industries? Because that's what we're seeing, right? Plantation social structures, specifically in the region that you study.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you see it in food practices. And so I'm kind of thinking about COVID, but I'm also connecting some other studies I've done and we're just, reading things that I've done.
Yeah.
But I think it shows up in food. When farm workers get here, they have to change their diets because it becomes really difficult to not only find the food that they, usually traditionally cook with, but also they got to switch up what they eat. They might eat less meat, more vegetables, or, just may have a harder time procuring food. And so that impacts how they eat or the dishes they'll make. So a lot of times it's so interesting because, when we were going through the data, you're reading just like these terrible outcomes, these terrible experiences that they're having, from extraction, exploitation, social outcomes, medical outcomes, public health outcomes, economic outcomes. But when people talk about like their work, when they're like, oh, yo crezco, I help this flower grow, or I do this, like when they talk about tending to the plants, Farm workers do it so passionately. And it's almost like prose, reading some of their words afterwards or hearing some of their interviews. It's almost like prose, the way they talk about the work that they do. It really just kind of is a contrast to, this larger, extraction, a factory in the fields type of work, right? So I see that. I see that. And I think it comes because this happens because farm workers have so much cosmic knowledge, right? It wasn't just them who tended to the land before they migrated, but it was also their abuelitos. There's a lot of stories that are embedded in that. And, like I a lot of times incorporate my family in my research. And like my mom me dice, we're from Guanajuato, also from agricultural communities. They're also from an agricultural family. My dad also, the milpa was always his job, or con las chivas was always his job, right? But it's interesting to hear them kind of talk about this difference when they came to California and saw the fields. They're table grape harvesters, and they've adapted some of those practices, right? A lot of times my dad says, oh yeah, my grandpa apparently would grow so much, he had a high yield despite only having a small plot of land. Mm-hmm. And it's because growing was different, right? You would go pray to the Virgen if you didn't have enough water, or you would go pray to the Virgen to have a good harvest. It was also, a process of caminando tu tierra, ¿verdad? Being in the land. And that is very different from what you see here in the U.S., right? In the fields, where farm workers can't even have their food, their lonche in the fields because, different organic food restrictions, right? And so I see that show up a little bit. The other piece I see is during COVID, and we talked about food insecurity. So in the U.S., how did farm workers deal with food insecurity? So just kind of getting back to the subsistence piece, to the land. Here, they did food sharing. They shared boxes of food that they received from food pantries. Pero in Mexico, they had what they call a cambalache, right? Where people would exchange food based on what they had in their milpa to have enough food. And this is so important. It's so important to have access to your own land and grow your own harvest and your cultivation because it gives you power. Farm workers were talking about early on in COVID when there were closures. Farm workers told us that they didn't send their produce. They didn't send their harvest to Guadalajara. They didn't send their harvest to, the markets. They kept it there to keep themselves and their communities food secure. So it's really important, right? This access to food not only shapes how you interact with the land, how you tend to the land, but it also goes all the way up to the cultivation, the subsistence, right? Your well-being. And then the other piece I guess I kind of want to talk about is my mom is such a great storyteller. She teaches me so much. And we've been talking about environmental justice, climate change. She does a lot of work back home in an incorporated community near Bakersfield. She does a lot of advocacy work because she's had to, right? And it's interesting now, having her talk about how climate has changed back home in Guanajuato. Guanajuato apparently is an indigenous word somehow it says frogs, right? It's about frogs, a place that has many frogs. And, just the other day, my mom was saying, los sapos ya no cantan, so you hear the loss of biodiversity. El Río Lerma, which is a rio that's nearby, ya no puedes nadar, ya no te lo puedes tomar, from big industries in Salamanca, not too far away, coming in and just really tainting the water, throwing all the waste in the river that impacts so many communities down. And so just kind of hearing her talk about, her connection to land in this way, and also just having her observe extraction, our capitalist system and the environmental impacts it creates has also been very illuminating for me. And I know it's not just my parents that have those stories. It's so many other farm worker communities also have that same cosmic knowledge, they've also observed this change back home, even before they migrated here. And so, yeah, I think that's an important connection and something that really impacts how farm workers continue to organize, live their lives as well.
Jennifer, you formerly served as a financial analyst for a local government in Texas. During that time, how did you come to understand the ways in which local governments allocate funds, or maybe don't, to support the ecological needs of the communities you're researching but also living in?
Yeah, I'm going way back. So yeah, I mean, I think, I'm a first gen, ¿verdad? And so going through college, I wasn't really sure what I was gonna do, but I knew I wanted to get a master's. And so I went out to Texas, in part because I used to be a really big cowboy fan. Because if you're from Bakersfield, you have to be a cowboy fan. It's like a thing. It's embedded in Chicano rap, and my brother really influenced my life with Chicano rap.
That's so funny. I love it.
Yeah, it's a thing I live with, right? And so I ended up in Texas. And there I did an MPA, Master's of Public Administration. This is sort of public administration really kind of gave me the first outlet to research. And in a few different ways, I ended up at my first academic conference through the discipline of public administration. And so it also allowed me to get an internship at a local government that then became, like the job that you said, a financial analyst. What I did is I supported with the budget at that specific city. And it was just an illuminating process for me to really understand how cities, how governments have different sources of income, how the governance structure to those cities, right? And how they really come up with policies. And for me, it was a really good contrasting point to back home. As I mentioned, I lived in an unincorporated area, so we're not in the city, super disinvested, continuously disinvested community. And it really opened my eyes to see how that is so intentional, and how there are, if our county government wanted to, they could totally invest in our community.
Yes.
And so I think it really opened my eyes into the limits of the the narrative that there's no funding for communities, for specific communities. And so I had a great mentor there, and so his name was Gary Livingston. He taught me a lot about budgeting, and that just really helped me, and it still helps me today. I still draw on some of those skills when I need a number crunch or something like that, or when I'm trying to read through a budget to see what a city did or where it's investing, or a county. And so it really helped me in that aspect. And so it connects to my research once in a while.
Yeah, that's cool. I love that, being able to pull from those jobs that you have that are just kind of like stopgaps in a way. Like you don't necessarily think, oh, this is going to help me, but it really does down the line.
Absolutely.
You are also, and you mentioned this a bit with your mom, but you're an advocate of storytelling and public projects in general, and seeing them as tools for change, right? As podcasters ourselves, like obviously we're going to agree with that approach. You yourself have actually been involved in a number of projects in recent years, and you mentioned briefly the podcast series. I think you were referring, was it the Voces del Campo series? Yeah. So what are the specific benefits that you see in storytelling and public projects, specifically when it comes to how Latinx communities learn about and engage in discourse around things like the climate crisis, environmental concerns, etc.?
Yeah. For me, a lot of the public storytelling has had to occur because it's connected not only to my research, but also my dual position in the community as being a community member and also experiencing some of the impacts. And then, as a researcher and as a craft. But for example, so I've participated in like the Leave No One Behind mural project. There's also been community engaged research that has, in some different ways or forms, had some public pieces to that work. I'll talk a little bit about the Leave No One Behind mural project. That I actually worked on that with one of your previous guests, Doctora Lisbeth de la Cruz Santana. And really the idea behind that is because I have a brother that's a deported veteran. And so for a lot of years, we're like, oh, that's normal, right? Like there's no issue there. And, we just kind of never had a grievance around why he was deported in the first place. But, soon we realized not too long ago, like maybe like in 2019, there was some more advocacy happening with deported veterans from themselves, right? Organizing. And so we're realizing that this was a much bigger issue, and it was a big issue. What we were finding across most of the stories of deported veterans is that they had already applied for their naturalization at some point in their early years when they got recruited and when they were in basic training or when they were deployed, but they were getting back home and, either they never received their interview date, or they got redeployed somewhere else and they weren't able to follow up. And there was not a lot of support for them. And so this was, something systemic. And so we wanted to bring attention to that in a different way, in a way that's more easily accessible. But we also wanted to do something else. And that was also connect the struggles of veterans, right? And immigrant veterans, deported veterans specifically, with the struggles of immigrants that are fighting deportation, right? But that are specifically fighting, that have been deported, that are fighting for a way to come home. And that, if we explain this, it's a very complex story, right? We got to talk about some of the structures. We got to talk about the shared structures of naturalization when you're a military service member. We got to talk about immigration policy, and that becomes really difficult to engage people publicly. But what becomes a little more accessible is maybe putting a face, art and a face. So we work with specific artists, the deported artist Javier Salazar, who himself is a deported permanent resident that lives in Tijuana. And so he helped us really create the murals that depicted stories, again, of deported veterans, but also DACA recipients in general, childhood arrivals. And with QR codes, they were able to go back to their stories. And so this was a really important piece because we were organizing across different local communities in the state, but also in Mexico. And so it was really important because it was sort of like a welcoming, veterans that had been deported, or immigrant community members that had been deported back home. Is like saying, no nos olvidamos, like your impact, your contributions were still really important, and you still have a community, a family that supports you and misses you. And so I think that was a way to kind of remove some of the shame. Specifically, I think immigration, deportation especially, is made to make people feel shameful, right? Mm-hmm. And deported veterans también, because it's like, oh, but you're a veteran, why were you deported? I mean, they also face Black and discrimination in Mexico, right? Because they're like, oh, he got deported, veterano, and like they have a bad perception. And this was a way to like remove that, strip that shame, and really refocus that energy into the limitations of the structures. And so it really brought together different coalitions. And again, that connecting of movements, I think, was really important. And so that's one of the public scholarship projects we have. There are a few other ones I'm working on, but I'll talk about a community engaged research project I worked in Southern Oregon, just to talk about like the impacts of it. In Southern Oregon, as I mentioned, in 2020, there were massive wildfires, specifically Latinx community members that lived in mobile homes. Their homes were completely gone, right, because of the fires. And it turns out that mobile homes are an important source of home ownership for Latinx communities. This specific Latinx community tended to be hotel workers and farm workers. So I linked up with the group of mujeres who were organizing again. They were finding that these communities were not going to be able to recover, right? They were not going to be able, they were having so much trouble with FEMA, with accessing any support. So they organized, they reached out to me. They wanted to do some type of engaged work to really capture what was happening. Because a lot of times the first piece is documenting, right? That's not it. Research is not all of it, but it's really acting on that research. And so we did that. They created a study with help from several others, and they interviewed several community members from specific regions. And again, they found the impacts of the severe impacts of home ownership loss, right? And so they really had an important story here to tell. And with that study, they were able to form a coalition, form a nonprofit in the region that now does a lot of cultural work for immigrant communities. But two, they were able to advocate to, let me back up. So what they did with the findings of the study is they went back to the community that they interviewed, right? They had a town hall at a church. They were talking about the findings. And apparently, farm workers started like thinking through this, like, well, how can we get our homes back? And so suddenly, one elder in the community suggested that people buy their homes back, that they pull their money together and just buy their community back. And that's exactly what happened. They were able to work, the mujeres from Coalición Fortaleza were able to work with a few other organizations like Casa of Oregon through an IDA process to purchase the lands and so now there is this collective, this communal mobile home community that's going to go back, and is actually in April, they're going to do the ribbon cutting ceremony, and these community members that were displaced will now be able to come back home. And that's really important. It's important. And this is where research meets comunidad and action. And that's really where I'm at in the research that I do in my area. That's what I want to do, is just really help ensure that the work that I do has impacts, right? That I'm working alongside community, and it's work that they want done, right? It's not on my own idea. And it has to be public facing if we want action, ¿verdad? And it looks different. Each study looks completely different.
Oh, love that. Love that. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, we really learned a lot, but also just hearing you talk about all of this and how passionate you are is really exciting. And I hope our students really take a lot from it. Before we wrap up, though, is there anything that you would like to mention? Anything you want to plug? People, where can listeners find you and your work? Anything like that?
Yeah, my website is jennifermartinezmedina.com. I have Instagram where you could listen to the podcast. You could listen to the podcast on Calag's story, or Voces del Campo on Instagram. You could also follow the Leave No One Behind mural project. I also talked about Coalición Fortaleza, so you could find them on Instagram as well. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Muchas gracias, Jennifer.
All right, Rojo, that was an amazing interview, don't you think?
Yeah, it was great indeed. I love Jennifer's emphasis on thinking about research as a practice that meets comunidad y acción. As she explained, her work was designed as a form of documentation and mobilization. She also presented the vital role community organizing has in creating funds and safety nets that can help in addressing systemic neglect, exploitation, and gaps in support. In addition, I appreciated how she described agriculture beyond the industrial, dehumanizing practices of monocultivos, la plantación, pointing instead to indigenous cosmic knowledge. She highlighted how agricultural work in the milpas represent passion and respect for the land, plants, bodies of water, and living creatures. The thought from that perspective, agriculture becomes a sacred ritual and a form of community empowerment and solidarity.
I love it. And it actually gets me thinking about us potentially looking at more indigenous centric content in future seasons.
Definitely, yes.
I think the message that stood out to me the most was this idea of communication, right? Whether it's about getting information to farm workers in languages that they read and speak, and that goes beyond English and Spanish. She mentioned like numerous indigenous languages that are spoken by farm workers in the region she studies alone. Or maybe it's about distributing labor and policy changes to the farm workers, or supplying communities with resources, or, making people within and especially beyond these communities aware of what's going on. I think it all boils down to this idea of communication. Jennifer mentioned collecting data and doing research as an important first step, but I particularly liked how she emphasized, and you mentioned this too, that action is crucial, right? We have to turn our knowledge into action, and seeing how she has done that through creative means, such as the Leave No One Behind mural project and the Voces del Campo, but also through like data research and collection with the COVID-19 study, and the policy proposals that they put forth as a result of that study. Like, hey, here's the data. Let's make this concrete change, right? It really drives home the message that we can and should be able to have a positive impact on our communities.
Yeah, it's important because she is presenting a critique on the agricultural system in the U.S. in a specific, and on the West Coast in a specific, but she's also allowing us to think about solutions, and solutions that go beyond the state and that are also community-centered, and that are definitely taking into consideration the immediate needs of those communities.
Yeah, that immediacy and tackling that head on. So, yeah, I mean, I think that was an amazing interview. I hope all you audience members enjoyed it as well. So we wanted to thank you all as audience members for joining us for this episode. Remember, you too can share your thoughts with us. You can always reach out to us on social media or by email.
Always follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. And we love to hear your thoughts about this or any other episode we have done.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family. Subscribe and leave a 5-star review to help with that pesky algorithm.
Estamos a la escucha.
Dale. Until next time.